esta reunión en español, entonces puede ir al chat. Ahí vamos a publicar el link para la reunión en donde usted podrá escuchar todo en español. En unos momentos vamos a ponerlo y si usted hace clic en ese link podrá escuchar esta reunión en español de manera simultánea.
All right.
Can
Thank
you
you,
copy and
Gabriella.
paste the link in the chat?
Yes. Can you or Laura do that, please? I'm not able to get to that right now. But we'll try our best. Well, I can do two things at once. 1 second, everybody. We want to make certain that everybody gets a chance to participate. So, Gabriella, in the chat, I put the link. And if folks have any trouble, I put the meeting ID and the password in there.
En el chat está el link en este momento y si tienen algún problema, ahí va a estar el número de identificación de la reunión y la contraseña.
All right, and we'll repeat that again for folks who may come a little bit later. Again, we want to make certain everybody has a chance to participate. All right, let's rock and roll, everybody. Again, I'm Andre Riley, the Executive Director of Communications, and I want to welcome you to our second Kirwan Town Hall. We met with you last week to talk about some aspects of the Kirwan legislation and what it means for our students, our staff, and our families. And tonight, this is part two. So I'm glad for those of you who joined us last week that you're returning, and those who are new, welcome. It's good to see you. As I just mentioned, this town hall is an opportunity to learn about the Kirwan blueprint for Maryland's future and hear from key district office staff about what this means for, again, our students, our staff, and our families. Now, before we get too far down the road, we do have some ground rules. For instance, if you have a question, we're going to ask you to put it in the chat. Please do not come on mic and start speaking. Just put it in the chat, and then during our designated Q&A periods, of which we have multiple Q&A periods, we will elevate your questions to the experts. It's highly probable that your questions will be based on the presentation. So that's a good thing for business. So you can save your questions, but please don't come on mic. Let's be civil, let's have a good time, and let's learn a bit about some legislation that, again, will benefit our schools and our community. Why are we having this town hall? Because in the coming weeks, we have to release our draft Kirwan implementation plan for public comment. But we realize that you need to be well informed to give us that public comment. So in addition to having these materials on our website with a URL I'll share a little bit later, and also, Rochelle, if you wouldn't mind, could you put that in the chat for me? Thank you. Rochelle is one of our communication staff members. She's awesome. We want to give you an opportunity to learn more about the law and its requirements. Tonight, we're going to give you an overview of the Kirwan blueprint, and then we're going to talk about two topics, One of them is high quality and diverse teachers and leaders, and the second is additional resources for students. Those are two key focus areas of Kirwan, and we know you're excited to talk to us about those. Last week, we spoke about early childhood education and college and career readiness, and we have a video that you can go watch from last week on our special Kirwan webpage. And again, we're putting the link in the chat. So without further ado, because we're just a hair behind, I'm going to introduce a superstar in this realm, Sandy Jacobs. She's our Executive Director for Strategic Resourcing and our Blueprint Implementation Coordinator. I'm going to share my screen. Sandy's going to start talking, and then we'll switch to part two. So let me share my screen. 1 second, please.
Thanks so much, Andre, and good evening, everybody. While we're waiting for those slides to come up, thanks to everybody who's here for part two, and thanks to everybody who is here for the first time. As Andre said, I am Sandy Jacobs, the district's blueprint coordinator. Every district in Maryland is required to have somebody who's the point person for all things Kirwan, and for city schools, that is me. So pleased to be able to share this information with you tonight. For those of you who joined us last week, this overview section is going to be a little bit of a double dose, but hopefully you'll hear something that maybe you didn't notice the first time around, before we are joined by some wonderful colleagues from here in the district office to talk more, as Andre said, about some of the topics. So diving right in, as I know, everyone's heard of Kirwan by now, right? It is also known, the law is actually known as the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. We are careful here in city schools, where we've had our Blueprint for Success for years. We have sort of dueling blueprints. So we are careful not to confuse the two. And we try to refer to the Kirwan blueprint as, in fact, the Kirwan blueprint. It should not be confused with our existing city schools Blueprint for Success. The law was passed in 2021. It's essentially at its heart a real comprehensive overhaul of how the state funds school districts in Maryland and how school districts in turn fund schools. And the primary emphasis of that overhaul is an emphasis on equity and directing funds specifically to the students who need them most, aiming to begin to correct, right, some of the decades and longer of underfunding for children from low-income families, for English language learners and students with disabilities. Also, Kirwan gives special attention to students who live in areas of concentrated poverty, so not just additional funds for students from low-income families, but also additional funds on top of that for students in schools with concentrations of poverty. Everything in the Kirwan law builds on the recommendations that came out of years of study from the Kirwan Commission. And essentially, it's divided into 5 main pillars. A pillar on early childhood, which we talked about last week. High quality and diverse teachers and leaders. We're going to talk more about that tonight. College and career readiness, which we also talked about last week. More resources for students, which we'll cover tonight, and governance and accountability, which we're not going to cover tonight, but there's more information on it about it on our website as well. So next slide, please. Just to tell you a little more about the Kirwan funding. So it's actually divided into about a dozen different funding streams that each have their own sort of formulas and rules about how those funds get distributed. But they are primarily targeted towards specific student needs, like compensatory education, which is the funding stream for students living in poverty, English language learners, special education students, etc. You can see that the overwhelming majority of our funds come from the foundation fundings, which are the straightforward per pupil amounts that we receive for every student, regardless of any demographic characteristics, and then compensatory education, which are those funds for students living in poverty. But while it's bringing additional funds, Kirwan is not a blank check. It isn't a sort of free rein, here's a lot of new money, spend it however you want. There are a lot of guidelines, requirements, and restrictions on how these funds can be used. And importantly, because these funds are really targeted to student need, that means that all schools don't benefit in the same way from the increases we're receiving under Kirwan. Students with schools rather, with the most high need students are going to get significantly more Kirwan funding than schools without those students. On the next slide. So just to show you sort of where we are, point in time, we, as Andre mentioned, we are working on our first implementation plan that will be submitted in the coming weeks and will be coming out for public comment soon. And this first iteration of this plan that we're submitting in March covers school years 21-22, so the first year that Kirwan was first starting, this current school year, which is really the first full year of Kirwan implementation and next year. And then there'll be follow-on submissions next year and then a few years down the road. Kirwan is envisioned as a decade-long implementation from 2022 to 2032. The funds ramp up and are phased in over the 10-year period, and also so are the requirements. So we're pretty pleased that we don't have to write a plan now that covers that whole 10-year period when some things, some pieces of Kirwan are really quite a few years away. So we get to focus on the parts that are ramping up now. With that, Andre, I think we're gonna pause and see if there's questions on this overview.
You are totally correct, Sandy, and I appreciate you. Very nicely done. Okay, as I mentioned at the beginning of the event, we're going to go through different sections of a presentation tonight, but we're going to pause to give you a chance to answer questions based on what you've heard. Admittedly, we're pretty early here in the presentation, so you may not have any great questions yet. So I have one to get you started. The first question is, as you're coming to our meeting tonight, what parts of the Kirwan legislation interest you the most? Again, last week we talked about early childhood. Last week we talked about college or career readiness. Tonight we're going to talk about additional resources for students. Tonight we're going to talk about developing diverse teachers and leaders. So as you're listening to the presentation, at any time, just put your question in the chat. I've got folks who are watching. We'll elevate those. And if you're lucky, I'll even see them while I'm running the deck. So I guarantee you it'll be fun. But without further ado, we're going to get on to the rest of our audience. Again, speaking of really talented folks, I have Jesse Papia and Will Moran. Jesse is the Director of Educator Effectiveness for City Schools, and Will Moran is the Director for Talent Management. And I'm going to show their deck. Will and Jesse, can you come on camera, please? Or please come on camera. How about that?
Hi, Andre.
All right.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Good evening,
There
Andre.
you are.
Thanks for the
Good to see
introduction.
you. All right, folks, you ready to have some fun? I'm going to share, and you might have to prompt me when you need me to switch slides, but you have the floor. Let's get to it.
No problem. So good evening, everyone. My name is Will Morant. I'm the Director of Talent Manager in the Office of Human Capital, and I'll be taking you through Pillar 2 for high quality, diverse teachers and leaders, along with my counterpart, Jessica Papia. So a couple of the initial key components of Kirwan Pillar 2 are our recruitment and retention efforts for high quality and a diverse workforce, which includes some specific initiatives and other things and strategies that we're putting in place to make sure that we can not only recruit the best and the brightest for our children here in the district, but also making sure that we're supporting our school leaders with being able to retain them for years to come. We're also looking to increase the rigor of our teacher preparation programs and further cement and establish new partnerships with local universities, which will lead to an increase in licensure, but also be able to implement the new mandates the state has put into place for teacher candidates and preparation programs overall. The third point, which is also critical, is comprehensive in-service educator training, which will include ensuring all educators have the training to support student behavioral health and the new guidelines for comprehensive induction for new teachers. I'll now turn it over to Jessie for her to go through the last bullet points before we open it up for any questions that our audience may have.
Thanks, Will. In addition, Pillar 2 also covers and describes a new career ladder, along with aligned professional development and evaluation systems, as well as improved teacher compensation, including salary increases for teachers with national board certification. This includes $10,000 of a salary increase for someone with national board certification, and an additional $7,000 for any national board certified teachers in low performing schools. And so it also outlines a cumulative 10% salary increase between July 2019 and the end of the school year 23-24. And it also discusses that there needs to be a minimum starting teacher salary of $60,000 in place for school year 26-27. And all of this is in an attempt to make sure that the profession of being a teacher in Maryland is seen as something that is, highly professional, highly sought after, so that we get the best folks in front of our kids. And with that,
Oh, I got it. Sorry, I stepped on you there, Jesse.
No.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Jesse. For our audience, I'm going to keep, this is not the slide that folks want to see. I'm going to keep this slide on the screen for just a second to give folks a chance in our audience. You just heard us talk a little bit about Pillar 2, high quality, diverse teachers and leaders. As you're seeing this information, what questions come to mind? How do you feel about that? And while we're doing that, well, we actually have a question. Will and Jesse, are there any resources allocated on the back end to support the application, hiring, and implementation process for high quality applicants?
So, Andre, I can actually take that question, and thank you, I believe, Tierra's Butler, for posing it. We are currently working in our department, both with my team, which is talent management, or commonly referred to as staffing, and the recruitment team, where we have taken feedback from the last hiring season from both principals, candidates, and other partners and stakeholders in the work to figure out some of the areas of growth and the barriers that we need to remove. Within the next 3 to 4 weeks, I would say absolutely no more than a month, we will be rolling out some additional resources, both for principals and stakeholders, but also as candidates going through the process of how we have approached revamping the application process to make it smoother, more streamlined, but also making sure that candidates feel like they are connected to both the district overall and the school where they're going to be hired, so that we can make sure that anyone that we've engaged that has a sincere interest in working for Baltimore City, we convert and we keep them to make sure they are in place by the first day of school. As we develop them and finalize what the changes are, we plan on sharing them with principals in the coming weeks so we can also revisit this forum or space to make sure that anyone that has inquiries or questions is also knowledgeable about them. But most importantly, that everything that we believe needs to be set in place to have a successful, candidate interview and selection process from when they first inquire, they begin to use our applicant tracking system at ATS, and they engage with our school leaders to when they actually start on their first day of school, feel seamless, is stress-free, and really overall contributes to a positive experience from the first interaction with city schools.
Thank you, Will. And you also received a thank you from the chat, so that's great. Will, we have another question by way, Claire. I see you in the chat. We're going to get to you, but before we leave this section, I'll get back to you. Will, Brenda has a question. Will and Jesse, what resources are being allocated to staff up and train the employees who will be delivering these services for human capital? When will staff be trained to do this? I understand that human capital is now understaffed.
So thank you, Ms. Connolly, for posing that question. I can start off, and then Jesse, if you have anything to add. This is very timely. My team actually worked off-site at one of our schools, Baltimore Design School, today, specifically to begin to map out and figure out what our approach is going to be to provide resources and support to both principals, members of their instructional leadership team, but also working with our other colleagues within our own office to make sure that we're able to deliver these services more specifically around the recruitment and retention of highly qualified and diverse candidates. What we are primarily focusing on is schools that we feel like have a significant number of vacancies at the start of this school year, schools that look like they have maintained a certain level of vacancies, and working with those principals of overhauling their interview and selection process, but also figuring out how do we prioritize which positions we fill and looking at what is the best way to make sure that the talent that we currently have in buildings that are high performing are being retained. We have been understaffed and we've had our own staffing challenges over the last year, but our new chief, Emily Milson, has made it a priority from day one for us to focus internally on filling all of our vacancies because it impacts the overall capacity for all of our teams to do the work and service our customers, the principals, and ultimately the students of our district. So I'll speak personal, local, and immediate for my team. I had 5 vacancies. We have filled 2. We have 2 more outstanding candidates in the pipeline, and then we will look to fill the last one, which will decrease the overall workload and the ability of my team to actually work with principals in a more in-depth way, which then translates in our ability to really help them when it comes to staffing and the more critical and core part of talent management so that we don't lose the people that we have.
Yeah, I mean, that's great, Will. And Will knows better and best about staying close to our current staffing structure and the way we're supporting schools. Something I'll offer that might be of interest to folks when thinking about some of the items in Kirwan under Pillar 2 are also taking a real kind of long-term view around how to build up a pipeline for future teachers. So some of it starting with those salary incentives, the career ladder, to try and make this a more enticing profession for college graduates to go into. And so there's also language in Kirwan that's going to be talking about induction programs, setting expectations around those, and also ways that institutes of higher education are working with LEAs and working more collaboratively to help make sure that folks are prepared to come into classrooms across Maryland.
Right. This is awesome. Thank you again. We have more questions. So apparently Will and Jesse, folks really want to talk about this topic, which is a good thing for us because we like to answer questions. All right, Annette has a question for both Will and Jesse. How many teachers are currently National Board certified, and what are the goals for 2026-27? What resources exist as enticements for current teachers to mentor future candidates?
Yeah, thank you, Annette. So thinking about our teachers who are National Board certified, so within Baltimore City, starting at the beginning of this school year, we had a little over 4 dozen of our teachers are National Board certified. What's interesting and unique about our city and our district is that for over 10 years, we have had a real landmark contract with our teacher union partners that have actually kind of created, locally negotiated career ladders for our teachers in ways that I don't think are typical in some of our peer groups within Maryland. And so rather than National Board necessarily being the way in which our teachers were demonstrating their impact and furthering their professional growth goals, they're actually pursuing our local created and developed career ladders and opportunities through our own pathways. So we do expect to see some increased interest in National Board, knowing that it's been elevated and being discussed more across the state, and it's holding a particular kind of space within Kirwan. And so we'll see an increase there, we expect. I wouldn't say at this point that we're thinking about particular goals to have a certain number of teachers be National Board certified by 26-27. One thing we are thinking about a lot is how to make sure that our population of teachers who are successful pursuing National Board certification are really representative and reflective of our teaching population overall. So we want to make sure that we're monitoring for any gaps in our teacher population and how successful folks are, how much they see themselves in that opportunity. So I'd say that's a lot more about what we're thinking about. And then finally, when we think about resources that exist to entice folks, potentially to mentor future candidates, I'm going to answer that in terms of resources around mentoring related to National Board certification. But if your question was about new teachers in general, if you wouldn't mind clarifying in the chat, I don't want to not answer your question, but there are lots of resources that we hope are really going to help people feel comfortable and interested pursuing National Board certification. A lot of them have really been named and are offered through the state, and those include continuing professional development credits that folks can use to renew their certification. So credits that they can receive by pursuing and being successful with National Board certification. There are the salary increases that we discussed, and then there's also a fee support program where between the state and the LEA, we make sure that the cost for someone who is pursuing National Board certification is covered, but between the state and the district. So it's not something that's falling on the individual teacher, so that any financial constraints don't become a barrier. There's also support programming in place, including we have some amazing professional learning facilitators who are providing support for their peers who are interested in National Board certification. Oh, and that's super helpful. Thanks, Annette. I hope that answers your question then.
All right, we're going to take one more question for this topic. And there will be questions we don't get to on the different pillars tonight, but have no fear. We have experts here that are logging these questions, and they may even just jump into the chat and answer them. So I don't want anybody to think that if we don't get to your question on mic, that we're not going to get to it. The last question for this topic right now is from Dr. Stephanie Harris. She says, hi, this is Stephanie. Which colleges and universities have you partnered with to provide training and professional development to obtain national board certification and or the highly qualified designation?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Harris. So, so this year is really our first year as a district where we've invested in having a support program in place, or at least the first time in quite a bit of time, where the district is offering these types of supports and resources. Again, we'd really invested in our locally developed career ladder opportunities for folks. So far, we have partnered with Towson University, or we're in the midst of that. And what we've really been working with them around is centering the supports and resources to build up our facilitators' muscles, so that they then can be working with their peers and teacher colleagues who they're supporting through the process. We also were able to finance professional development for our facilitators that was hosted through Stanford University. And it's one which National Board actually promotes. And so we feel like there's some real, that we're able to really dig into some high quality content for our folks so that they can then translate that, have a strong program of support for our teachers here. I also want to make sure to name Morgan University has, that is a university I'm aware of, where there's a program in place. And I just really want to laud the more kind of grassroots approach there, where the support that's in place through Morgan University around pursuing national board is something that was really developed through an interest and energy from teachers saying that this would be helpful for them. And so they're in more of a cohort approach there, getting support, and it will help them to submit their portfolio and hopefully be successful in getting national board certification. So there's a couple of examples that I'm aware of partnerships with colleges and universities.
And the only thing I will add to that, Jesse, and thank you, Dr. Harris, for your question, is that specifically for working with universities on highly qualified designation, to be fully transparent, we've seen a significant increase in conditioning certified candidates. So some universities that specifically come to mind that are working with us to set up agreements or create a direct pipeline for our candidates to enroll in their programs to become professionally certified, or Notre Dame University. Just last week, my counterpart and I, Sarah Rebello, who's the director of recruitment, met with both UMBC and Coppin State University to discuss ways that we can engage not only candidates that are in teacher preparation programs, but even those that are undeclared majors to gain and garner some interest in education, but also look at some of our individuals that are currently working in the school system that need to create a viable pathway to be professionally certified, to enroll in their programs, whether at the graduate degree level or the additional coursework that is needed based on MSc requirements. Jesse kind of referenced Morgan State University, where we've had an amazing and long-standing relationship, where we also look to enroll some of our current employees into programs there, but also look specifically working with our Black teacher retention work group partners on any paraeducators, other instructional support positions, or non-instructional aides that really want to venture into teaching and get in front of our kids as the sole instructor of figuring out, based on their current level of education, where and how can we get them into programs that will lead to full professional certification. But those specific universities, and the other one that comes to mind is Stevenson University, where they are working with us to create either tailored and specific programs or already have things in place. And we're just trying to make sure that we get the information out to those that are interested and create opportunities where it is very easy for them to take advantage of tuition reimbursement, but also have a very clear understanding of what coursework they need to complete from the district to make it seamless to them becoming professionally certified or highly qualified, as you referencing your question in the chat.
Great. Will and Jesse, I want to thank you a lot. There's a question from Nikisha Powell in the chat. If you wouldn't mind, can you answer it within the chat? We're going to move on to another pillar, but Nikisha's been very kind, and I want to make sure we get her question answered. Okay, so now we're moving on. And now Next up will be Sheila Drummond Cam
Nope,
and
me
Dr.
first.
Courtney.
It's gonna be
Oh.
back to me first, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I just jumped right in, didn't I, Sandy? You got the floor. You have the floor.
So sorry to interrupt you, Andre. So before we turn to our content experts, and if you could go to the next slide, please, Andre. So the reason that I'm introducing this first is Pillar 4, unlike the other pillars we've talked about, which are really centered around a specific topic, even though those topics are both broad and deep. Pillar 4 is a bit of a grab bag because more resources for students who need them, more resources for student success, it covers a lot of different topics. So I just wanted to quickly introduce what those topics are to give you a full sense of what is in Pillar 4, which includes, again, we talked about that there is a dedicated funding stream for English learners, which is a per pupil allocation for each English language learner in each school building. More dedicated funding for special education students. Notably, over the 10 years of Kirwan, special education funding is on track to ramp up very, very considerably. As we know, support different students with different needs. Some very intensive needs can be very costly to provide students all the services that they need and are entitled to. And over the 10 years of Kirwan, special education funds really ramp up quite a bit. Ensuring expansion of behavioral health supports for students, behavioral and access to behavioral health services. And then the biggest piece within Pillar 4 is an expansion of community school programs, specifically for schools with a high concentration of students living in poverty. And uniquely here in Baltimore City, not only do we have a high concentration of students living in poverty, but uniquely we have had community school programs for quite a while. And we are really ahead of the game. Other districts that are beginning their Kirwan implementation are really at very early stages with community school programs, and we aren't. And so that's why we've invited Sheila Drummond Cam to tell you more about our community school programs. And then when we turn to the Q&A for this subject, we'll also have Dr. Courtney Hill, who's the executive director of our Office of Special Education, available as well. But with that, I'm going to turn things over to Sheila. I'm going to say that
Good
again.
evening, everyone.
There you are.
I'm Sheila Drummond Cam. I'm the manager for community schools for Baltimore City Public Schools. I have a whole team of people, amazing people that work on the community schools initiative. Just to give you a little background, a community school is a set of partnerships. It's a place and a set of partnerships. So it's a school that provides services and support that fits the needs of the neighborhood and the schools. And it also brings in integrated partnerships that look at academics and health and social services and child and community development and college and career and readiness and family engagement, everything that a child and a family will need in order to meet with school and success later on in life. And so that's not the right PowerPoint slide. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So we're looking at strategic partnerships. In fact, last year, we brought in the community schools, brought in 2,000 plus strategic partnerships and leveraged $5.4 million in leveraged funds. I think the interesting thing about community schools is we've been around since 2005 in Baltimore City. We went from 50 to 123 in one school year when the concentrations of poverty funds were first introduced. We have 133 community schools in Baltimore City. We have 122 that are funded by the concentrations of poverty funds. So we're making sure that all families and students receive all of the resources that they need in order to be academically successful, but also positive learning conditions all the way around. We look at active family and community engagement, including educational opportunities for adults and family members of students at the schools. And we also have wraparound services that look at expanded learning time and opportunities for after school during weekends and in the summer, and enhanced physical wellness and behavioral and mental health services. So we really are looking at surrounding the schools and the community with the resources that they need in order for students and families to be successful, and also linking students and families to the resources that they need. So very specifically working collaboratively with all of the folks who can help make sure that students are successful. So school-based teams, neighborhood associations, partnerships that are needed. But the key to that is the community school coordinator. It's a dedicated staff member. It's a person hired in order to help implement the community school strategy at the school and work with those school-based teams and make sure that those key components of community schools are implemented. And there's so much more we could say about it, but specifically within the blueprint, these are the things that we're looking at: that community school coordinator, those strategic partnerships, wraparound services, and working in collaboration with other departments, active family and community engagement.
Thank you, Sheila. I
You're
appreciate you.
welcome. Thank you.
But hang around, stay on camera with me. I'm
Okay.
going to get your slide up. And now we're going to open up the floor for questions. Again, I'm going to go back to the first one. Again, pillar number 4, more resources for students who need it. And especially, we're going to talk about our community school coordinators. Again, this is your chance, members of the audience, to ask us questions about this pillar. Ask us questions about, again, what are we doing in our community schools that we haven't discussed already? And what about pillar 4? And I see Sandy's on the screen, so I think she may want to say something.
Yeah, I actually, while people are thinking about their pillar 4 questions, I wanted to ask a question to Sheila. No, Sheila, come back. Knowing you can't get away so quickly, knowing that we have been doing this for a while, just curious, what would you say are, what are the benefits that we see from community schools? I mean, right, like the things that they are bringing are you've already named, but what are we seeing in terms of benefits to our schools?
Well, first of all, I think one of the benefits is our community school coordinators, and our community school coordinators come from, we have 18 community-based organizations that hire our community school coordinators, in addition to community school coordinators that are hired by city schools. So every school has at least one dedicated community school coordinator. There are a few of them that have 2. But I think the things that they bring to the table and that community schools bring is that opportunity for collaborative work inside and outside the school. And community schools coordinators promote food stability. They work with 56 Maryland food banks, so they distribute at sites. Community school coordinators lead and participate on attendance teams, climates teams, SST teams, in some instances, the instructional leadership team. So they are a part of the school, and they're helping to collaboratively bring resources and connections at the school level. And making sure that everyone understands who is in the school, what they do, how to connect to them, how to reach out to that community school coordinator and get the resources they need, and having someone else that has the fluidity to be able to think with them on things like attendance issues and climate issues, and working with, like in our office, we have in the Office of Communication, Engagement, and Enrollment, we have the Office of Family and Community, we have community engagement, and we have family engagement. We work very closely together. We understand what the work is about. So I think we bring to Baltimore City Public Schools, and community schools brings to other places, just that idea that everyone is responsible for the education and the support of our children and families. And we make sure that the folks who know our children and families best have the opportunity to work in partnership with schools who are educating our children and removing those barriers to make sure that children can learn and teachers can teach.
Thank you, Sheila, but don't go too far away. But Sandy and I are going to stay here. So Sandy, I need you. Wait a minute, we have a question. I actually do have a question for you, Sandy, but I want to tackle Annette's question because she's asking about community schools. Sheila,
Yes.
how will the additional blueprint funding enhance the current community school model? The current model seems a bit amorphous, no dedicated funding levels or timelines yet. What are the amounts of money that will be dedicated on a yearly basis under the Kirwan plan to improving the range of additional services currently available? How can the community help city schools advance this important piece of the agenda?
Wow,
So
that's a lot of questions all at once.
Yeah.
That's a lot of questions all at once.
All right, we'll start with the first one. How will the additional blueprint funding enhance the current community school model?
I think one of the ways is it helps to support the community school coordinator, making sure that those coordinators are in the school. It also is going to help support the work of the lead agencies to make sure that the right resources and the right funding and the right supports are available to them. We'll also possibly have funding that's available for schools to hire additional community school coordinators. So having more than one community school coordinator, particularly in our larger schools, will also be an advantage that we will have. And then being able to possibly have funding that each individual school and community school coordinator can use at their discretion to be able to help support the work. And if anyone who is on the line who is also part of the community schools team wants to add to that answer, I would ask them to come off mic and do so.
All right, Sheila, thank you.
One thing I'll add there is I know you also asked about how the funding increases. The community schools is funded under the concentration of poverty grant, and which is actually divided into two parts. It's got a personnel grant, which, as Sheila talked about, makes sure that that community school coordinator has that dedicated funding year after year. And then there's also a per pupil amount that is a very complex formula that sort of ramps up based on both the year of implementation that the school is in and the level of concentration of poverty in that school. So it doesn't have a simple answer, but the funds do increase over time.
Right, and Sandy, can you address the third question? How can the community help city schools advance this important piece of the agenda?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. I mean, as Sheila said, the whole idea of a community school is that it's a community school, right? That it's everybody's school, and so that everybody feels that connection and ownership to it. I think, as Sheila mentioned, there are a lot of partnerships in place across these schools, but schools are in really different points of implementation. Some schools are really early on, and I think really need that additional community engagement and initiative, right, to make sure that they get off to a really strong start going forward. And other schools are farther along, and there I think the challenge is making sure that community engagement remains, right, and that it doesn't sort of just become the status quo as it doesn't feel new and fresh anymore, and how we're making sure that partnerships are both renewed and new partners are brought into the mix as well. But I can't imagine a more important place for community engagement than community schools.
Thank you, Sandy. But you stay.
Can I add something, Andre?
Sure. Oh.
It was something that we kind of put to the wayside, but one of the ways that you can help is in 2016, Baltimore City adopted the community schools policy ADH. We are in the process of revising that policy. And in a few more days, there will be an opportunity for people to go on the Baltimore City Schools website and complete a survey looking at the old policy, comparing the revisions that we made, and also being able to give us some feedback on that new policy and what they think are the most important areas that we need to look at in terms of community schools and what we're going to say in the policy. So I would encourage you that when that link is promoted on the website, that you please take advantage of it and answer the questions. And I can drop the link in the chat if you'd like me to.
By all means, Sheila, please do.
Thank
you. And I want you to stay with me as well, because I have a question for you and Dr. Hill from Brenda Conley, who's been very patient with us. Brenda asked, can you identify what you consider the greatest challenge for quality implementation of the blueprint under this pillar, that being pillar number 4?
Are you asking this of me or Sandy? Or
You.
both of us?
No, you guys, Sheila.
And I think it would be great to have Dr. Hill weigh in here too. Just from your perspective, what are the greatest challenges?
I think some of the greatest challenges is this isn't an easy concept to understand. And so when we're talking about implementing the strategy, when we're talking about making sure that we are working collaboratively with all stakeholders to make sure that students succeed, we have to be very clear and understanding about what those relationships are about and how they look, and be very patient as people begin to try to figure out, what does the community school coordinator do? What are their responsibilities? What should be their relationship to leadership in the school building? What should principals understand about the relationship of community schools? So I think probably the biggest challenge is really getting everyone on the same page and clearly understanding what the strategy is about, and then walking that fine line of implementing pieces of the strategy, but also making sure that each community school kind of forms itself to the needs of that particular community and that particular school. And I think that's the biggest challenge.
I think, good evening, everybody. This is Dr. Hill. I think from the special ed perspective, it's similar and a little bit different. So I do think that it's important to make sure we're engaging the right stakeholders in the conversation. But I think what's most important is kind of transitioning to a space where we start to really think of students as a stakeholder. Because this element of the pillar is really about, making sure our students who are diverse learners have access to the resources that they need based on their individualized education plan. So, increasing opportunities for students to be involved in the decision-making process about how we move with this pillar is a big sort of challenge for me, because it's just something that is new to this process, but very important to this process. So those are my 2 cents.
Thank you.
Thank you both. And Sandy, I have a question from my good friend Claire, who's been, speaking of patient, she's been waiting since the beginning of the event. And she actually has 2 questions. I'm going to go back to her original question. Sandy, will the March 2023 submission cover the current building budget cycle? Community budget forums are this month, and building budgets due at the end of the month?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the plan that we'll be submitting, which will be out for public comments soon. Actually, we aren't asked to address specific budget questions, and so that part of the budget cycle, which I know is a little ahead of the timeline, it isn't a worry that doesn't overlap. What very much will be included in the plan is all the community input around priorities that have informed the larger budget process. We have very much paid attention to and incorporated into developing the plan.
Thank you, Sandy. Now, this question is actually, you may be able to address it, but I think it's mostly for Sheila. So Sheila, can you come back on camera? In fact, I have two for you. This first one is interesting because I work in the department that's home to both of these units. Claire asked, how does the role of the FCE liaisons work with the community school coordinators?
That's a great question, and that's something that we have addressed just a little while ago, because there is some similarity to their work, but not. The FCE department of that particular department and those specialists are really looking at parents supporting the academic elevation of their students. Community schools coordinators are looking at all of those other things that interfere with children being able to be successful. However, they need to work in partnership with one another. In fact, we had a training not too long ago where we brought together the FCA liaisons and the community school specialists, and we had a conversation about who does what and what category each one's work falls into, and how do they support one another. So that's something that we're working on and working with and fine tuning. So stay tuned, because like I said, we're working on revising the policy. One of the things that we look at when we're revising the policy is how do we align with other policies in the district. The Family and Community Engagement Policy, KCA, is one that we're working at aligning with and looking at what's the role of the community school coordinator in terms of family engagement, and how do we work in close collaboration with those liaisons at the school. So that's a great question, and we're working on it.
Right, Sheila, and I have one more for you based on something you said earlier.
Okay, looking at it.
Yes, Arnett says, you mentioned that there are 133 community schools and 100, I guess, community schools coordinators, and 122 are funded through the district's funds. How are the other schools funded? Additionally, what specific community resources are funded other than the community school coordinator?
So we have 133 community schools. 122 of them are funded by CPG funds. Now, some of those CPG funds are coming directly to those schools because they're first-time community schools and they're receiving concentrations of poverty funds. But one of our primary partners within the community school strategy is the Family League. And the Family League receives funding to help support community schools, in addition to those community schools that receive concentrations of funding funds, the grant funds. But we also have additional schools out of those 122 from those 133 that are funded through other sources. So some can be funded through city funds, some can be funded through philanthropy, some can be funded through schools that have bought in for the funding. So they're those schools that are not receiving concentrations of poverty funds are receiving funding from other funding sources.
Thank you, Sheila. And I promise this
You're
time I'll
welcome.
let you go away, but I think we've covered all of our ground. So I thank you much. And I thank you to all the experts that joined.
Andre, can I jump in quickly just for a moment?
Yes, but you gotta tell us who you are.
It's Tina Hike-Hubbard, Chief of Communications, Engagement, and Enrollment. And I just want to add to Sheila's excellent answer about the funding for the 122 versus the 133. The Kirwan formula, and I saw Dr. Anderson also put this in the chat. The Kirwan funding formula will actually allow the addition of community schools annually based on a formula that the state sets for the poverty level at certain schools. And so we know, for example, that approximately 10 more schools will be coming on this school year, funded through the CPG dollars. And as the Kirwan plan is implemented year after year, additional schools will be added based on the state's set rate of poverty for our schools. So while those schools are funded through other sources, like Sheila just mentioned, we will also be adding schools annually as the state determines the poverty level to go down so that other schools can be in the strategy through CPG funds. Just thought it was important to add. Thank you, Andre.
No, thank you,
Yeah,
Tina.
and I can add to also, thanks, Tina, that I appreciate that. The other thing that is good that you might want to know is with those new schools that have been identified as receiving concentrations of poverty funds, we will get 10 new schools, but we'll also get 3 schools that are already community schools that are funded through other sources will now be funded from concentrations of poverty grants. So we'll have 13 schools that receive concentrations of poverty grants, and 10 of those schools are brand new to the community school strategy.
Awesome. Thank you, Tina, and thank you, Sheila. And seeing no other questions, I want to thank all of our experts tonight for coming and spending time with our community members, for sharing their feedback, answering their questions, and helping us to lay the best explain how we're going to implement the Kirwan legislation and what it means. But now as we're getting ready to depart, I'm putting some items on the screen that I want you to react to. Yes, in it, I said we wanted feedback. I'm going to tell you how to give us additional feedback. We have a poll and the QR code for that poll is up on the screen. Your input is important to us. When you fill this very brief poll, you're going to tell us, you're going to help us to understand what parts of the Kirwan legislation interest you the most. What would you like to learn more about? It's really brief. There's a QR code on the screen. For those of you who are more enterprising, you can type in that very long URL. However, just so you know, the same poll will be accessible on our Kirwan website, and that URL is at the bottom of the screen, baltimorecity.schools.org/Kirwan. If you find you have additional questions, and we're excited about this, send us an email to communications@bcps.k12.md.us. Rochelle and other members of the communications team will be more than happy to forward your questions to the experts on any of the topics related to Kirwan, and we'll be certain to give you a response. We're recording tonight's presentation probably around this time tomorrow, but no later than Thursday. We're going to have this recording up on the Kirwan webpage. Last week's recording is also up on the Kirwan webpage. So if you didn't attend last week, we really, really encourage you to go look at that video. I want to thank you to everybody who attended tonight. I want to thank you to all of our experts. Sheila, there's a question in the chat from Ms. Anderson looking for the link that you mentioned. We'll make certain that we share that with you directly as well, so don't think you're going to miss out. But to everybody who attended tonight, thank you for coming out. I'm going to give Sheila just a second. Those of you who do not need that link, we will see you the next time at one of our fabulous town halls. There's the link. Thank you all for attending. You have a good evening.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, we are closing the Zoom meeting. Have a great night.